You ever have one of those mornings where you step outside, expecting the usual quiet, the birds, the smell of dew on grass, and then, bam, you realize your little corner of the world isn't yours anymore? That was me last Saturday, standing at the edge of our ranch just outside the sleepy suburbs of Cedar Grove, sipping my first cup of coffee, and noticing it immediately. Tire tracks. Not just any tracks, but the ones that crisscrossed the soft dirt right across Grandpa's old gravel road. The one he had painstakingly built himself when he first bought this property 30 years ago. And at the end of every track, you could practically hear the smug little echo of HOA Karen's laugh. She'd been treating our ranch like some shortcut for months now, darting her little SUV through our land as if it were a public highway. And I had reached the limit. For context, my name's Jake Hollister. This ranch has been in our family for decades, mostly quiet farmland and pasture, a few outbuildings Grandpa insisted we maintain, and a stretch of dirt road that connects us to the main street without ever needing to be on the busy highway. We've got neighbors, yes, but they respect boundaries. Everyone knows where the lines are, except, apparently, HOA Karen. She's this woman with a clipboard, a permanent scowl, and an obsession with control that borders on the absurd. The first few times she drove across Grandpa's property, I tried the polite route. I waved, made small talk, even joked about the dust, thinking maybe she just didn't realize the impact. But it didn't stop. Every week, she'd squeeze her SUV past the gate, sometimes with her friends following behind like some convoy, all the while leaving ruts in the road, scaring the livestock, and acting like she owned the place. And I don't want to sound dramatic, but there's something about seeing your family's land treated like an afterthought that digs into you. I remember standing there that morning, coffee cup halfway to my lips, thinking about the old oak trees lining the driveway, the fence Grandpa built by hand, the wildflowers we planted. This wasn't just dirt. It was history, it was pride, it was a place where every plank of wood and every footprint mattered. And Karen? She treated it like it was a shortcut to her yoga class or the community pool. I clenched my jaw, feeling that mix of anger and disbelief that bubbles quietly until you realize you have to do something before it's too late. Grandpa, of course, had been watching all of this with a sly grin for weeks. He's 78, wiry, sharp as a tack, and he has this way of seeing problems most people can't. He calls HOA Karen the human speed bump, which is funny until you realize he has a plan, and then you realize the speed bump is about to push back. That morning, I finally went to him, muttering something about ruts, disrespect, and maybe the HOA needing a lesson. He just laughed, shook his head, and said, "Let them think they're clever. We'll teach them without raising our voices." I blinked. I wasn't sure if he was being serious or sarcastic. He rarely is sarcastic. He's just patient, and that patience terrifies people when they finally realize it's been a storm brewing quietly for decades. So there we were, standing at the edge of the driveway, the dirt cool under our boots, the sun just starting to climb, birds hopping nervously near the fence. Grandpa leaned on his cane, squinting at the tracks. "See those lines?" he asked. "Those are lines of entitlement, my boy. Lines of thinking the world bends to your whim. I think it's time we redraw them." And I swear, in that moment, I felt my chest tighten. Not fear, not anger exactly, but the kind of anticipation you get when you know something big is about to happen. Not violent, not dramatic, but clever, precise, and totally satisfying. Meanwhile, I could see HOA Karen's house down the street. She wasn't even aware yet that we were planning something. She was probably watering her plants or checking her emails, blissfully ignorant that her little shortcut, her tiny streaks of arrogance across our property, was about to meet the sharp wit of Grandpa Hollister. I remember thinking about how strange life can be, how ordinary people like us can end up in these bizarre standoffs with someone who thinks rules don't apply to them. And honestly, there's a certain humor in that. Once you step back and breathe, the kind of humor that makes your shoulders relax even while your mind races. That week, Grandpa and I walked the property every morning, inspecting the tracks, planning quietly. We marked stakes, moved rocks, measured angles, and laughed quietly at how oblivious Karen and her little SUV gang were. And in those quiet moments, I realized the deeper part of the story wasn't just about a shortcut. It was about respect, about teaching lessons without losing your own integrity, about seeing an injustice and figuring out how to correct it with patience, brains, and a little old-fashioned ingenuity. And let me tell you, we didn't just plan a trap. Grandpa had a design, subtle but genius. A series of soft ruts disguised as natural terrain. A little diversion that would force anyone trying to cheat the path to slow down, stop, maybe even reconsider their behavior. We tested it with some of the smaller vehicles around the property, making adjustments, tweaking angles, all the while imagining Karen's face when she realized the road she thought she could take as a shortcut had become a little inconvenient. I couldn't stop smiling. The anticipation built, like the quiet before a summer storm, and every day we walked that stretch of dirt road, I felt the thrill of what was coming. Not revenge, not in the mean sense, but poetic justice. A lesson in humility, served with a side of clever engineering and Grandpa's subtle humor. And that, more than anything else, made the ranch feel alive again, made our little corner of Cedar Grove feel like a place we could protect, defend, and take pride in. By Friday, everything was set. Stakes were hidden, diversions ready, and the tracks freshly smoothed to disguise the surprise. I leaned on the fence, watching the sun hit the old barn roof, thinking about how this little conflict had turned into something bigger than a road, bigger than HOA Karen, bigger than any ruts or tracks. It was about family, history, pride, and the satisfaction that comes from solving a problem in a way that leaves you laughing quietly in the shade while someone else learns a lesson the hard way. And that's where we leave it for now, because the stage is set, the trap is ready, and HOA Karen still has no idea what's about to unfold. Grandpa and I sit back on the porch, sipping iced tea, grinning at each other with that shared look that says, they have no clue. And I know, deep down, that this is going to be a story I tell for decades, the one where patience and brains beat arrogance and entitlement, and a little cleverness goes a long way on a quiet suburban ranch. Friday morning came and the ranch was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. That's the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The kind where every rustle of leaves or distant bird call feels amplified, like the world itself is waiting for the next act to unfold. Grandpa and I were on the porch, sipping coffee, surveying the stretch of dirt road that had been Karen's unofficial shortcut for months. We hadn't slept poorly, not at all, but the thrill of anticipation had this subtle electricity in the air, and I could see it reflected in Grandpa's eyes. He wasn't nervous, never nervous, but that little smirk, that barely there curl of his lips, told me he knew exactly how today would go. By mid-morning, Karen appeared. Of course she did. Her little SUV rounded the corner onto our property like she owned it, tires kicking up clouds of dust, her expression a mix of determination and smugness, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was starring in some suburban version of a reality show. And she wasn't alone. Two of her friends were in a second car, following closely, as if she were leading a parade of entitlement straight across Grandpa's land. I stepped aside, leaning against the fence, trying not to grin too widely, and let them roll in. Grandpa, standing just behind me, rested his hands on his cane, eyes scanning the road like a general overseeing a battlefield. I could almost hear Karen's thoughts as she drove, her internal monologue of efficiency and self-importance playing in her head. Shortcut, time saved, maybe a few steps fewer to the HOA meeting. Perfect. She had no clue that every inch of that road, every tiny bump, every curve had been meticulously planned for her little parade. The stakes we'd hidden the day before were subtle but effective, small ruts disguised as natural terrain, a few strategically placed divots, a patch of loose gravel perfectly positioned. Nothing violent, nothing permanent, just the right combination of inconvenience and surprise. As she hit the first section, I saw her grip the steering wheel tighter. The SUV wobbled slightly over a hidden rut, and she muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "What the?" before trying to steady the car. I stifled a laugh and looked at Grandpa, whose expression was a study in patience, his eyes twinkling with unspoken amusement. "Notice," he whispered, "how quickly arrogance turns into panic when it meets its first consequence." And I couldn't help but nod. It was one of those rare moments where I felt simultaneously proud of the cleverness we'd employed and deeply entertained by watching someone else squirm ever so slightly. The second car followed, even less aware of the subtle sabotage. Tires slid over loose gravel, and their driver, one of Karen's friends, let out a sharp yelp, nearly hitting the brakes entirely. Karen, ahead of them, was now clearly aware that something was off. Her confident smirk wavered, replaced by irritation, disbelief, and then anger. I could hear her muttering, "What the hell is going on? This road, what is this?" And that, of course, is when Grandpa's genius became fully apparent. The trap was designed to slow, disorient, and force them to respect the path, or at least to make them realize that shortcuts come with consequences. I watched them cautiously maneuver through the middle section, each vehicle negotiating the subtle diversions, the dips, the patches of loose gravel that seemed random but were anything but. And I have to admit, there's a certain artistry to it. Grandpa had designed it like a puzzle, a gentle, humiliating puzzle that forced Karen to pay attention, to slow down, to respect the boundaries she had ignored for months. And the best part? She didn't realize it was intentional. In her mind, she was just struggling with bad terrain, while we, behind the fence, were witnessing the perfect intersection of patience and planning play out in real time. At one point, Karen slammed on the brakes to avoid a slightly deeper divot, tires squealing, and muttered a string of words I can't even repeat on a family-friendly channel. Her friends in the second car were now honking and gesturing, confused, yelling things like, "Karen, what's wrong with this road?" And she, red-faced, shouted back, "It's your fault for following me. Don't touch my car." The irony, of course, was perfect. She was blaming the universe for a consequence she hadn't anticipated, a lesson she had ignored for months. Grandpa and I just leaned on the fence, sipping coffee, grinning quietly, and I remember thinking how surreal it was. Months of quiet frustration, small indignities, and subtle disrespect had built to this perfect crescendo, and now, as Karen and her friends navigated our little trap, we were witnessing justice in motion. Not violent, not cruel, but precise, humorous, and deeply satisfying. I even caught myself imagining the story we'd tell at Thanksgiving. How Grandpa turned a road into a teacher. And HOA, Karen learned a lesson without a single word being raised. As the vehicles finally made it past the middle section, Karen's face was a mix of exhaustion, indignation, and begrudging respect. I could see her lips pressed tight, her hands gripping the wheel, and I knew she had finally realized something. This road was not hers to command, and our land was not to be treated lightly. Grandpa leaned toward me, whispering, "Notice how quickly arrogance falls when met with patience and foresight." And I laughed quietly, shaking my head. He was right, of course. It was one of those rare life lessons that could only be taught by experience, cleverly disguised as a road hazard. But the climax was yet to come. The final stretch of the road, the one we designed with the most subtle but effective obstacle, awaited. A gentle rise in the terrain, covered in loose gravel and lined with small stakes disguised as natural markers, created a narrow path where a cautious driver would need to slow and focus, or risk tipping slightly off course. Karen, still unaware, approached it with her usual mix of confidence and entitlement. I held my breath as the SUV hit the incline. Tires slid slightly, she corrected too sharply, and the SUV wobbled. The friends behind her were yelling now, panicking slightly. And then, the gentle divot we'd engineered caused the SUV to stop just short of the path's edge, forcing Karen to actually pause, assess, and then carefully navigate forward. She had no idea it was intentional, but it was poetic. I watched her slowly regain composure, muttering under her breath, while Grandpa chuckled softly beside me. And that, my boy, is how lessons are best learned. Without anger, without yelling, just the road speaking the truth. I smiled, thinking about how true that was. The road wasn't cruel, it wasn't violent, it wasn't spiteful. It was just a reflection of respect, or the lack thereof. And Karen, who had spent months thinking she could bypass boundaries, had finally met a consequence she couldn't ignore. By the time they made it past the final section, I could see the mix of frustration, embarrassment, and begrudging respect on Karen's face. Her friends were quiet, no longer smirking, realizing that the shortcut they'd been exploiting was a lesson waiting to unfold. Grandpa tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture of triumph and humor, and I felt the same wave of satisfaction, that quiet thrill that comes from seeing order restored without ever losing your cool. without ever compromising your integrity. And in the aftermath, as they finally exited the property, slowing down, muttering apologies that probably weren't sincere, I realized something deeper. This wasn't just about a shortcut or a few tire tracks on Grandpa's land. It was about respect, about understanding consequences, about the way subtle actions can teach lessons more effectively than confrontation ever could. And it was about patience, foresight, and creativity, the kind that turns everyday frustrations into stories you tell for years, the kind that turn a conflict into a memorable life lesson. Grandpa and I stood there, watching the dust settle, taking in the quiet of the ranch restored, the birds returning to the trees, the air smelling faintly of soil and summer. And I felt a strange mix of pride and amusement, thinking about how ordinary life, small disputes, and minor frustrations could unfold into these rich, cinematic moments that stay with you. Karen had tried to bend reality to her will, but in the end, patience, intelligence, and a little humor had won. By evening, as the ranch settled into the kind of calm that feels earned after a storm, though one that was mostly imagined, I thought about the lessons here. Life, like roads, has boundaries. Some people ignore them. Some people test them. But the ones who respect them, or at least learn to, are the ones who navigate the world successfully. And sometimes, the road itself is the teacher. By Saturday morning, the ranch felt calm again, the kind of calm that follows a small storm, even if it's more mental than literal. The road, which had been Karen's daily shortcut for months, was quiet. Tire tracks still hinted at past transgressions, but now they were measured, respectful, because anyone who tried to take the shortcut now had to slow down, navigate carefully, or reconsider entirely. I walked the gravel, feeling the firmness of the road under my boots, the subtle divots and slight curves we'd engineered with Grandpa, and I felt this profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with order restored. Grandpa stood beside me, leaning lightly on his cane, smiling that quiet, triumphant smile of his, the one that says, patience works, cleverness works, and pride without patience doesn't. I thought about Karen, probably sitting somewhere, fuming, confused, realizing that her little shortcut, her audacious little daily act of entitlement, had met its match. She didn't understand exactly what had happened, and that was perfect. That's how lessons stick, subtle, undeniable, and unforgettable. I could hear her muttering under her breath, probably blaming the road, the gravel, maybe even the sun, but deep down, she had to recognize it. Some things aren't hers to take, some boundaries aren't hers to ignore. Grandpa chuckled quietly, glancing at me with his sharp eyes. See, Jake? The world has a way of teaching people who think it owes them. And we didn't even raise our voices. I nodded, realizing how true that was. There's a certain art to standing firm without confrontation, to creating a situation where the consequences naturally teach the lesson. It's the kind of wisdom that only comes with years of observing human behavior, of watching entitlement meet resistance in clever ways. And Grandpa had that in spades. Later that afternoon, Karen finally drove past again, this time more cautiously. Her usual swagger was gone, replaced with an almost grudging respect, though I doubt she'd admit it aloud. Her friends followed at a measured pace, muttering, probably reassessing their daily habits. I leaned on the fence, sipping iced tea, letting the scene settle in, and I couldn't help but feel amused at the subtle poetry of it all. The ranch wasn't just a patch of land anymore. It had become a teacher, a guardian of its own rules, a place that demanded respect through clever design rather than conflict. And yet, as satisfying as it was, I felt a deeper reflection settling in. This wasn't just about a shortcut, a road, or Karen's entitlement. It was about understanding boundaries, about seeing consequences clearly, about realizing that people test limits because they can, and that patience, observation, and creativity are sometimes far more effective than confrontation or anger. Grandpa had taught me something far beyond the mechanics of the trap or the subtle engineering of the road. It was a lesson about life, about human behavior, and about the quiet power of integrity. By evening, as the ranch settled into the soft glow of sunset, I walked down to the far end of the road, looking at the subtle marks we'd left, the slight dips that forced respect and caution, the curves that demanded attention. Everything was deliberate. Everything spoke without words. And in that quiet, I thought about how ordinary moments, everyday frustrations, and encounters with difficult people can evolve into something meaningful if you pay attention, plan wisely, and act with intention. Grandpa joined me at the fence, leaning his cane lightly, watching the horizon. People think shortcuts save time, he said, but sometimes they cost respect, patience, and lessons learned the hard way. I laughed quietly, nodding. It was true, and I realized that the real victory wasn't just about preventing Karen from taking the road. It was about reclaiming our space, our pride, and the story we'd now tell for years, a story that would outlive this moment. Over the next few days, Karen and her friends didn't attempt the shortcut again. I'd catch glimpses of them, slow and cautious, navigating around our property, and I could see the subtle shift in their behavior. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The recognition that boundaries exist, that respect is earned, and that cleverness can outmatch entitlement without a single raised voice. And that, in its own strange way, felt more satisfying than confrontation ever could. I spent time that week reflecting on what had happened, thinking about patience, observation, and the small ways in which human behavior reveals itself under pressure. The ranch, which had always been a quiet place of work, reflection, and family, had become a classroom. And I realized that sometimes the most important lessons aren't taught with anger or punishment, but with structure, subtlety, and a bit of clever planning. That's a lesson I think anyone can take to heart, whether it's dealing with neighbors, coworkers, or anyone who thinks they can ignore boundaries without consequence. By the time Sunday rolled around, the ranch had returned to its usual rhythm. Birds sang in the trees, the wind rustled through the tall grasses, and the gravel road was quiet, firm, and respected. Grandpa and I sat on the porch, watching the last rays of sun spill over the land, and I felt that rare, quiet contentment that comes from a conflict resolved wisely. We hadn't needed to yell, to threaten, or to escalate. We had acted with patience, creativity, and observation, and the results spoke for themselves. And yet, as I sipped the last of my iced tea and looked down the road, I couldn't help but wonder, would Karen ever truly understand the lesson? Would she reflect on entitlement, on boundaries, on respect? Or would she simply move on, carrying a vague sense of discomfort that she couldn't quite place? Maybe she would, maybe she wouldn't, but the story remained ours. The lesson was clear, and the ranch had reasserted itself quietly, elegantly, and effectively. Now, I want to ask you, the viewer, what would you do if your land was treated like a shortcut? How far would you go to teach a lesson without breaking the law, without anger, without confrontation? Do you think what Grandpa and I did was clever or over the top? Have you ever encountered a neighbor like HOA Karen, and how did you handle it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I promise you, people have wildly different opinions about respect, boundaries, and justice in communities, and I want to hear them all. Because at the end of the day, the ranch is quiet again, the road is respected, and Grandpa and I learned a little more about patience, cleverness, and human nature. HOA Karen got her lesson, subtle but undeniable, and the story will live on in our family. A reminder that sometimes the best solutions are the ones that teach without shouting, that punish without cruelty, and that restore order with intelligence, humor, and timing. So tell me, what would you do in a situation like this? Would you be like Karen and test limits? Or would you respect the path, the boundaries, and the lessons quietly written in the land itself? Comment below, share your experiences, and let's see what the world thinks about entitlement, cleverness, and the quiet victories that make life a little sweeter.